Hammer. I used a hammer to drive the nail into the wood. Mallet. I used a mallet to break up the concrete. Axe. I used an axe to chop down the tree. Saw. I used a saw to cut the board in half. Scissors. I used scissors to cut the paper. Chisel. I used a chisel to remove the old paint. Pliers. I used pliers to grip the nail. Wrench. I used a wrench to tighten the bolt. Screwdriver. I used a screwdriver to tighten the screw. Level. I used a level to make sure the picture was hanging straight. Tape measure. I used a tape measure to measure the length of the room. Square. I used a square to make sure the corners of the table were straight. Awl. I used an awl to poke a hole in the leather. Putty knife. I used a putty knife to spread the spackle on the wall. Pipe cutter. I used a pipe cutter to cut the copper pipe. Guillotine shear. I used a guillotine shear to cut the metal sheet. Allen wrench. I used an Allen wrench to tighten the hex screw. Screw extractor. I used a screw extractor to remove the stripped screw. Torque wrench. I used a torque wrench to tighten the lug nuts to the correct specifications. Bench vise. I used a bench vise to hold the piece of metal while I filed it. Center punch. I used a center punch to mark the spot where I wanted to drill the hole. Wire stripper. I used a wire stripper to remove the insulation from the wire. Wire crimper. I used a wire crimper to crimp the connector onto the end of the wire. Pipe wrench. I used a pipe wrench to tighten the pipe fitting. Crescent wrench. I used a crescent wrench to tighten the nut. Combination wrench. I used a combination wrench to tighten the bolt. Socket wrench. I used a socket wrench to tighten the nut on the car axle. Phillips screwdriver. I used a Phillips screwdriver to tighten the screw. Flathead screwdriver. I used a flathead screwdriver to tighten the screw. Torque screwdriver. I used a torque screwdriver to tighten the screw. Tri-wing screwdriver. I used a tri-wing screwdriver to tighten the screw. Hex screwdriver. I used a hex screwdriver to tighten the screw. Ball peen hammer. I used a ball peen hammer to peen the metal. Sledgehammer. I used a sledgehammer to demolish the wall. Claw hammer. I used a claw hammer to pull out the nails. Staple. I used a staple to secure the paper to the wall. Staple gun. I used a staple gun to staple the fabric to the wood. Riveter. I used a riveter to rivet the two pieces of metal together. Wood chisel. I used a wood chisel to chisel out the mortise. Brick chisel. I used a brick chisel to chip away the old bricks. Multi-tool. I used a multi-tool to open the can. Diagonal cutting pliers. I used diagonal cutting pliers to cut the wire. Needle nose pliers. I used needle nose pliers to bend the wire. Locking pliers. I used locking pliers to clamp the pipe. Coping saw. I used a coping saw to cut the intricate curves. Handsaw. I used a handsaw to cut the wood. Carpenter's saw. I used a carpenter's saw to make precise cuts. Pruning saw. I used a pruning saw to trim the branches. Chainsaw. I used a chainsaw to cut down the tree. Pruning shears. I used pruning shears to trim the hedges. combination square, protractor, hand file, rasp, wood plane, smoothing plane, block plane.